Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted these German Blitzkrieg Infantry figures. These are the plastic 28mm scale models made by Warlord games, though I did get these specific models in the Italeri packaging, but they are exactly the same models as you get in the bolt action box. If you would like to see the assembly video, there's a link in the description and in the upper right corner of the screen now. Okay, enough of that, let's get to painting. I started, as I normally do, by priming these figures in black, though I didn't film it for whatever reason. Then I spray a base coat onto the coats with Vallejo model colour German field grey. I'm not being too neat with this, so it does go all over the model, but that's not really a big deal. As you can see, I did this a long time ago because I'm still using my crappy cardboard box spraying booth. Next, I made a mix of roughly 2 parts field grey to 1 part model colour buff. I spray this downwards onto the top of each figure as a sort of zenithal highlighting, and I try not to go too heavily with it. The idea behind this is to represent sunlight hitting the figure from above, and also maybe a bit of fading from said sunlight. Obviously the helmets do get hit, but I'm mostly interested in getting this onto their coats, because most of the other things are going to be different colours. I have a look at each figure from various angles as I'm spraying to see if I need to spray some more or not. The highlight does look pretty stark while the paint is wet, but when it's dried it's a bit more subtle as you can see here. I painted the trousers with Vallejo model colour London Grey. Obviously I'm trying to avoid getting this colour on the coat, though it's not a problem getting it pretty much anywhere else at this point. This colour looks a little bit light at the moment, but we'll deal with that later. When I was reading about the colours people like using on this kind of uniform, there was, unsurprisingly, no real consensus on what colour the pants should be. Some say the same as the coat, others say light grey like I've used. I decided on London Grey because the differences in colour between the upper and lower parts of the figure breaks up the model and makes it look a bit more interesting to me. Moving on, I paint the helmets. For this I used model colour German Camo dark green. It's pretty easy to get this colour only on the helmets. There's not really a lot to say about it. Obviously I haven't painted the skin yet, so there's no need to try and avoid painting the skin green. At this stage, the helmet looks drastically different to the coat, but washes and highlighting and such later on is going to take care of that. I use the same colour to paint I think it's a map pouch? Whatever it is, it's on the chest, and it isn't too challenging to paint. I'm not sure if this thing should be this colour, but it adds some variance and interest to the front of the uniform. Continuing with the camo dark green, I painted the gas mask canister. Depending on where you've glued these onto the model, it can be a little bit fiddly painting them without also hitting the uniform. The mess tin could probably also be painted in the same colour at this time, but I decided to paint it another colour and we'll get to that later. I figured this colour might work nicely as a generic metal parts colour, so on any figures that have an ammo box, of which I had 2, I painted them German camo dark green as well. Nothing too tricky about painting ammo boxes really. As you can see, the camo dark green looks quite a bit darker once it's dry. Things are going to get a bit darker though. I apply a wash of Army Painter Strong Tone. This is diluted roughly 50-50 with water, and I apply it fairly heavily all over the model. This should not only add darkness to the gaps and recesses, but also darken down everything just a touch. Before I do any highlights to the uniform, I decided to paint the skin. I've not used it before, but I figured trying AK Interactive Light Flesh as a base for this was a good idea, and obviously I'm applying it to any visible pieces of flesh. And I'm trying to be careful to avoid painting the uniform or helmet with this, but little mistakes are kind of inevitable, so I'll almost certainly have to do some touch-ups later. That's nothing to worry about though. Like a lot of the AK Interactive acrylics seem to be, this one comes out of the bottle just a little bit thin. Not too thin though. It kind of saves me from having to thin them myself, which is nice. It does however mean that I had to do a few coats to get a good solid coverage. I follow this with a wash of Secret Weapon Drying Blood, which was diluted roughly 2 parts drying blood and 1 part water. Again, I'm trying to avoid the uniform areas, but a little spillage won't be too hard to clean up, and it might look like blood as though the soldier has been injured or maybe killed somebody and been splashed with their blood. Maybe, I don't know. I then highlight the skin with AK Interactive Light Flesh again. I apply this mostly to the upper areas of the face that might be hit by the sunlight, as well as the tops of the hands and such. I did this with a dry brush. Unfortunately, my lovely makeup dry brush is a bit too big for this, so I'm using an old one that I made from a worn out brush, which is a bit more suitably sized. This is where I made the most mess on the surrounding areas, though I was very careful so I didn't end up with too much to tidy up anyway. Then I add some highlights with AK Interactive Highlight Flesh. Seems appropriate enough. Despite this already coming out of the bottle quite thin, I thinned it even further, roughly 50-50, with Vallejo airbrush thinner, because I didn't want it to go on too heavily, and I figured having it sort of translucent would be a good idea. I apply this with a fine brush to the upper surfaces of the skin areas, like the nose and along the tops of the hands and fingers. I thought this made the skin look a little bit too light. My aim is to have these guys kind of dark, like they've been sunburned a fair bit and are covered in dirt and grime. You know, almost like they've been fighting a war. Next, I add Secret Weapon Flesh Wash. This was thinned roughly 1/4 flesh wash to 3/4 water, so it's pretty thin. I figure it's probably best to have to do a couple of extra layers of this if the first coat was too light, rather than one coat that's too heavy. Here's a comparison with a figure that hasn't had the wash yet. I think the wash makes it look better. I don't often paint flesh, so this is kind of an experiment with it. I've still not settled on a method that I really like for doing skin. At this stage, I feel like it's good enough that I can move on, and I can always make modifications later if I feel a need. Now it's time to add some highlights to the uniform. First, I dry brush the coats with straight German field grey, the same colour with which I base coated them. This is very subtle and hard to see on the camera, but the main idea was to bring back a lot of the base colour here after the wash was applied, leaving the recesses and lower areas slightly darker. I figured any highlights I made might be made redundant by that wash, so I just decided to do them all afterwards. To highlight the coat, I made a mix of roughly 2 parts field grey and 1 part buff. I dry brushed this on fairly lightly. I'm trying to mostly brush it on downwards to try and get this colour on areas that the light would be hitting. Again, I would prefer to use my nice dry brush, but it's just too big. Using this smaller one allows me to be fairly careful, so I can avoid accidentally painting the skin and such. Here's a comparison with a figure on the left who hasn't received this highlight yet. The difference certainly isn't massive. I'm not really a fan of extreme highlighting like you often see on gaming models, so what I've done is pretty subtle, but it's definitely there. If you do want a stronger highlight, just mix your colour a little bit lighter. In this case, you would add a tiny bit more buff. Nothing too tricky there, really. Next, I dry brush the pants with London Grey, again trying to avoid the coat. I don't think the pants needed to be any lighter than this, so I only applied 1 dry brushing here. Moving on, I dry brush some highlights on the helmet and gas mask can. For this, I use a mix of roughly 4 parts German Camo dark green and 1 part buff. I'm trying to be especially careful with this around the helmet. It is always possible to fix mistakes later, but I would really rather not have to. I guess my tip here is to be careful. It saves time, even if it feels like you're actually painting slower. Next, I decided to paint the canteens. For these, I used model colour Hull Red. When I was looking for reference images of the canteen, I saw some that were a similar colour to this and I thought it would be interesting. When painting these details, I tried to think ahead and paint them in such an order that would minimise having to paint over other things. The most obvious example being painting straps last. Not all the figures have canteens, but some do have pistol holsters. I decided to keep using the Hull Red on those. It might be the wrong colour, but I don't care. I think it makes the model look a bit more interesting. Then I make a mix of roughly 3 parts Hull Red to 1 part buff, and I use this to dry brush a highlight onto the canteens. Side by side you can see that it does make a difference, however slight. I didn't use this colour to highlight the pistol holsters, I'll do that with something else. After that, I decided to paint the bread bag with Vallejo model colour German Camo Beige. With a colour like this, you might find that you have to do a couple of layers to get good coverage. I try to make sure I'm getting all of the areas of this bag, like the loops that go over the belt. I also decided to use this colour on the straps from the gas mask canisters, at least the ones that have it visible anyway. Not all of them do. I didn't show myself painting the thinner strap that most of the figures have, but I used the same colour again for that. And for the bedroll that some of the figures have. I think it's a bedroll anyway. I thought about using a different colour for this to add some variation, but not many of the models have this, so I figured it was just easier to use the same colour again. Some of the figures have a strap around their helmet, and I used the German Camo Beige for these too, because why not? It breaks up the green nicely. This is a bit fiddly. The trick is to go slowly and take your time, as is often the case. That should help to avoid making mistakes, but if you do make a mistake it is okay. We all make them sometimes and it's not the end of the world. Next, I painted the upper part of the canteen, which I assume is a drinking cup. I used model colour Gunmetal Grey for this. I'm being extra slow and careful here because pretty much everything around this is already the colour I want it to be. Continuing with the same colour, I paint the mess tin, again being as careful as I can. I especially want to avoid making mistakes with metallic colours like this. They're a bit more annoying to remove or paint over. The webbing has a ring in the middle of the back, so I take a fine brush and apply the gunmetal here too. It is a bit messy at this point, but I should be able to fix that later when I paint the straps. Next, I paint the metal parts of the guns, but I think the gunmetal is way too bright for this. So I mix it roughly 50-50 with Vallejo Model Air Black. I think this worked quite well. The black is pretty thin, so the mix didn't require any additional thinning. I did do a kind of messy job here, but at this point that doesn't matter too much. As long as I don't paint over the flesh colours, it's fine. I don't only paint the rifles with this colour, the machine gun also gets it, pretty much all over, nothing too tricky here. I didn't film it, but I also painted the SMG and pistols with the same colour. I figured this colour would work pretty well for binoculars too. I could have done them in black, but I was already using this colour, so why not? Again, I take my time to avoid painting the flesh areas. Then I realised I had one rifleman with a bayonet on his gun. I used Gunmetal Grey on this because I figured it should probably look pretty shiny. Ideally, I would have painted this at the same time I was doing the mess tins and such, but oh well. Sometimes we just have to get those colours out again and go over the things we've missed. Then I painted the metal portion of the shovel. I used Vallejo Model Air Camo Olive Green for this. The shovel heads should probably have a little bit more wear on them, but this was a small area and I didn't feel like it would be that noticeable. If anybody asks, these are new shovels that haven't been used yet. I also apply this to the explodey part of the stick grenades. I'm not sure if that's entirely realistic, but I have seen pictures of grenades in a similar colour and I thought it looked good, which is the main thing. Of course, not all of the figures are holding grenades like this, but some of them do have them tucked into boots and their belts, so you might have to look around for them. Next, I paint the wooden furniture on the guns with Vallejo model colour Beige Brown. At this point you're probably sick of hearing it, but I'm trying to be pretty careful here. There aren't really any other surfaces onto which I can make free mistakes. This colour is pretty light, and going over a darker colour you'll probably have to do a few coats. I probably have painted the wood colour onto some of the areas of the gun that should be metal, but I'm not really worried about that, as long as it still looks like a gun. Keeping on with the beige brown, I use it to paint the handles of the entrenching tools. Nothing too tricky here, just be sure that you get the colour on all areas of the handle. Then I figured why not use this colour for the wooden handles on the grenades. It looks decent, though when it's wet it does look pretty close to the flesh colour, which I don't think looks all that good. We want some contrast there, but washers should take care of that later on. Then I got the model colour hull red out again to paint any rifle straps. This might look pretty simple to do, and it is. Next I used AK Interactive red-brown leather to paint the knife cases. Cases? Holsters? Sheaths. That's what they are. Sheaths. I am good at words. I used the same red-brown leather colour to paint the handful of whatever these big bags are. It might be the wrong colour, but the same could be said about every colour I've used so far. I did consider doing these in a more yellowy colour, but I do quite like this red-brown leather, so I wanted to use more of it. And use more of it I did. I used it to highlight the gun holsters. I figured this kind of highlighting would look good here rather than trying to dry brush it. I feel like it makes the edges look fairly worn. I did a similar kind of highlighting on the gun straps. It did end up being a bit subtle, but it is there. One of my figures has his helmet off, and I decided to paint the inner padding bits with red-brown leather. I've no idea what colour the inside of the helmet might actually be, but I figured this would look more interesting than a darker colour. When I was looking for reference images, I noticed that while the straps are mostly black, the parts where they loop around the ring is a brown leather colour. So, another use of the AK Interactive red-brown leather. I applied a bit more of it to the straps than I really needed, but it'll be easy enough to correct when I apply the black anyway. At this point I realised that I had missed the straps on the front of the gas mask cans, so I painted those with model colour German Camo Beige. The colour might be a bit light, but I'll darken that down with washes later. Also, I kind of like the contrast with the canister itself. Then I use Vallejo Model Air Black and paint the straps. As you can imagine, this took quite a while to do. Partly because I was taking my time to avoid messing up as much as I could, but also because these figures just have a lot of straps and belts. I also used the black to paint the little pouches that are hanging off the straps too. It is a bit hard to see where I'm putting the paint in these shots, but I'm sure you can figure it out if you're painting your own Blitz Germans. More straps. I paint the straps on the mess tins with the same black paint. I actually found this kind of tricky to do, but mostly because of the glare on the metallic colour. I guess that's just what happens when you paint under so many lights. I do the same thing with the canteens. Most of the examples I saw of these had black straps, but I was tempted to use a different colour for some contrast. But as you can see, I went with the black anyway. The helmets also have straps and I painted those black too. This was quite fiddly. Not so much painting the flat outer part of the strap, that's fairly easy because it's raised away from the face. It's the edges of the strap that are tricky to paint without messing up. Patience and taking your time are highly recommended for this. Still using the same Model Air black, I paint the leather holder thingy that surrounds the diggy part of the entrenching tool. This wraps around all edges of the shovel and down around the handle where it joins the shovel bit. Obviously I'm trying to be careful here and avoid all the surrounding areas. Also, I paint the inside of these against the figure's body, just in case anybody happens to look through there. Then, on the figures that have the bedrolls, I paint these straps black. Despite being careful, I was a little bit messy on these and the straps ended up looking a bit too wide. That's okay though, I can fix it later. Then, I paint the boots. Let's pretend to be surprised that I'm still using the Model Air black. I've seen pictures of examples of Blitz Germans with black and brown boots. I chose the black because why not? Painting these is pretty simple, and there's a fairly obvious point on these figures where the pants end and the boots start. Some of the models have glasses. I decided to base these in black because it just made sense. Again, I'm being careful here, also thankful that only a couple of the figures have glasses. The glasses are fairly chunky and raised up from the face, so that does help quite a bit. Like with the helmet straps, it's the narrow parts that contact the face itself that are hard to paint. Now it's time to work on a few details that not all of the figures have. I guess I already did that with the glasses, didn't I? But whatever. I have a couple of figures that have belts of ammo for the machine gun. I base coated these with Vallejo Game Air Bright Bronze. For the most part, these ammo belts are raised far enough away from the figure that it's pretty easy to paint them without messing up the uniform beneath. But do be careful anyway. I managed to get bronze on the lips of the guy with the ammo belt around his neck. It was easy enough to fix, but it's even easier not to have to fix things. I add a highlight along the edges of these with Game Air Polished Gold. This is pretty subtle and probably not entirely necessary, but I did it anyway. Once that's dry, I apply model colour black grey down the middle of the ammo belts where the strap holds the bullets together. These bullets are a bit rough and I couldn't actually see a raised part that I could paint along, so I kind of guessed where the colour should go. It is a bit rough, but I think it looks reasonable enough. After that, I paint the hair of the man with his helmet off. I base coated the hair with model colour brown sand. I wasn't totally sure this was an appropriate colour for blonde hair, but I figured, why not? I can always repaint it later. Then I apply a dry brushing of model colour dark sand. Nothing too tricky about this. You can see that I managed to get some of the previous colour on the figure's forehead. At some point I fixed that with the AK Interactive Highlight Flesh, though I didn't film it. On with the hair. I gave it a wash with undiluted soft tone. I figured that would be a decent wash. Not too dark, but dark enough to add some colour variation and depth. Once that was dry, I dry brushed the hair with some more model colour dark sand. I try not to go too heavily with this. The result is, in my opinion, okay. Not the best, but not the worst. It should look very reasonable at a distance from which you would be seeing it on the gaming table. Darker hair might have been better, more contrasty, but I wanted light hair for reasons. Then I get the model colour black grey out again and use it to highlight all of the black areas that I thought needed it. There are a lot of black bits, so there were a lot of tiny bits to highlight, and it was fairly time consuming, but I figured it was worth it. For the most part, I did this with a fine brush, trying to hit edges of things like straps and pouches. The result is a little bit subtle, but that's fine. I really just wanted a bit of colour variation. On the boots, I used a dry brush to apply the same colour. This is obviously fairly simple. I don't go too heavily because I don't want them to look too worn or anything like that. These guys care about keeping their boots and stuff looking neat, and they're not going to be based on mud or anything like that. When you're painting boots, and I suppose the rest of the model too, but mostly boots, it's a good idea to have a think about what sort of base you're going to put the models on. Next, I make all the little corrections that I needed to make. Nothing too interesting, so I didn't film it. Once that was done, it's time for washes. I mixed Army Painter Strong Tone, roughly 3 parts Strong Tone to 1 part water, and I applied it to the bread bags, and all of the straps that are the same colour as those bread bags. I go fairly heavily with this and I'm not super worried about being neat. A little bit of spillage around the edges will make it look like shadow, making the part look a bit more three-dimensional. I also apply this to the wooden furniture on the guns just to darken that down a bit too. And I add it to the big bags that some of my figures have. I went really heavy on these because there wasn't any other highlighting, and this should help bring out the straps and such quite nicely. Continuing with the same strong tone mix, I hit the wooden handles. This is mostly entrenching tools, but the stick grenades get the same wash too. I also use it on the bedrolls, making sure to get it all over the part, especially the ends. This should sit in the folds and make it look more three-dimensional. I then use dark tone and apply it to the machine gun ammo belts because they were way too bright. This is undiluted dark tone, though I still had to give it a couple of coats before I was satisfied with how dark it was. I'm obviously trying to be neat with this. Sure, the belts do stand away from the models a bit, but it's still very easy to splash something thin like this onto places you don't want it. Then I thin the dark tone roughly 3/4 dark tone to 1/4 water, and I add it to some edges on this bag. And then I apply it on and around most of the straps. This isn't so much to do anything to the black, though it does affect the grey highlights. What it mostly does is add a little darkness and shadow around the straps and such. Then I thin the wash even further. If I had to guess, it's probably 1 part dark tone to 4 parts water. I just added the water to the existing mix though, so there's no way to be totally sure. I apply this all over the uniform and skin. This is too thin to stand out too much, but it should add a very subtle shade into any recesses, especially the slight ones that didn't quite catch the previous washes so well. It also makes the model just a touch darker all over. I then decided to add some detail to the binoculars and glasses. This is pretty simple. I just used some Vallejo Model Air gun! It's gunmetal, but the bottle just says gun, which I find amusing. I just carefully apply a dot of this onto the ends of the binoculars and the lenses of the glasses. It doesn't quite look right and stands out a bit too much as it is, so I take some undiluted army painter blue tone and paint it over the shiny bits. This does two things. It darkens the shiny bit down quite a lot, and it adds a blue sheen to it when you catch it at the right angles. Then I take the gunmetal and very lightly paint some of the buckles on the straps. I didn't try to paint every single strap. I don't think they would all be very shiny, but a couple here and there make a nice kind of accent. I also touch up some of the rings in the webbing on the backs, and the belt buckles because those might also be shiny. People like shiny belt buckles, probably. I then take some undiluted strong tone and gently apply it to the eye recesses and mouths to try and make those stand out a little bit more. If you really wanted, you could try and paint the eyes, but at this scale, and the distance at which these guys are mostly going to be viewed, I feel like it's not really worth the effort. It's quite tricky to convincingly paint eyes at this scale, and to be honest, some of the sculpts are a bit janky around the eye area. I feel like trying to paint eyes overcomplicates things a bit, and it works well enough to just darken those areas to give a hint of depth and shadow where the eyes are. And it definitely looks a lot better than a mess of black and white that jumps out at you unrealistically. The result is the face looks a bit ugly close up, but it should look fine on the table, which for these figures is the goal. I then used Vallejo Model Air White to add some of the insignia to the collars. This was very fiddly, but I did manage. It's even kind of neat on some of the figures. Before anybody starts whining about inaccurate markings on the uniform, these are only meant to be representative. They are probably meant to be a lot more complex, but I'm not really interested in going to that level of detail. They'll look fine on the gaming table anyway. And that's it. These German Blitzkrieg Infantry are now complete. I gave them a coat of AK Interactive Ultramatte varnish and then attached them to their bases off camera. I'm sure you don't need me to show you how that goes anyway. As it happens, I made these bases myself. If you want to see how I did that, there's a link in the description and in the upper right corner of the screen now. Check it out. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how these figures turned out, though they did take me a bit longer to get painted than I had initially expected. I still managed to keep to my 1 painting video per month schedule, and I did kind of do 2 painting videos this month, so there is that. It's no secret that I don't enjoy painting infantry figures as much as I do tanks and other vehicles, so this wasn't the most fun I've ever had painting, but it was still an enjoyable time. I think that might be down to this set of figures having less models in it, only 12. When I painted the British infantry there were 20 or more, so I guess less is better, at least for me. I guess what I'm trying to say is I probably won't be painting any infantry figures again soon, and I guess that I did enjoy doing this. Some people seem to think that I hate painting figures. I guess that might just be down to some people's worldview being black and white, where if you don't love something you automatically hate it, which is weird, but if I did hate painting infantry figures I just wouldn't do it. I think I've done an okay job. There are certainly things that could be done differently, things like slight colour changes and different washes maybe, though I can't see anything major that I would have done differently. I guess there are some things that I could have painted more neatly or not painted at all. I'm going to have to paint Germans again at some point, so I can apply the changes in my process to those when I get to them. I say this pretty much every time I do a painting video, but while I did use some reference images and such, I've taken a lot of liberties and painted things colours that I thought looked best. I don't really care if they're historically accurate or not. You might be surprised at the number of comments I get about this, some quite aggressive. Those are the ones I laugh at the most. Fortunately, a lot of you are able to phrase your opinions on painting colours interestingly and informatively, and that's always welcome. Anyway, I work by the rule of cool, so if I think it looks cool, that's what I do. In my opinion, online discussions about historically accurate colours are really only good for suggestions, and they should definitely be taken with a grain of salt. Maybe I'm rambling a bit. I rather like the look of the field grey I chose to paint the coats with, particularly in conjunction with the washes I used. I also think having the pants such a different colour looks pretty good. On reflection though, I might have chosen a darker green for the helmets and gas mask canisters. I'm also really happy with how these figures look on the bases, though I am a bit disappointed that the MG Loader figure's ammo belt doesn't quite line up with the machine gun itself. Having drilled holes for the pins the models were mounted on, and using superglue gave me very little room to adjust once the figures were actually on the bases. Oh well, they still look cool and should look pretty good on the gaming table, and that is more or less the standard to which I've painted them. Sort of. In my opinion, they look best around 50 to 60 centimeters away, and that's about how far I hold them away from my face when I'm observing my work, which is a little bit closer than the average gaming table distance, but I do like to get close to my models when I play, so they do look a little bit worse the closer you get. That's fine though. It is kind of hard to paint something to look great at both long and short distances, and it's not like they look awful up close anyway. I guess I'm rambling again. Anyway, I can't really think of anything else to say about this. I'm excited to move on to the next project, but I'm not going to tell you what that is. You might see it if you watch my streams though, if you ask nicely. As always, I will put a list of the paints I've used in the description below, so if you're looking for colour suggestions or if you just want to follow me step by step, you can find that there. I would like to encourage you to make your own colour choices though. I just find that kind of satisfying. If you want to, let me know what you think of these angry German shooty boys in the comments section below. Or maybe, if you've got your own Germans, you could come over to our excellent Discord community and show us there. That would be rad. If you haven't already, why not sub here on YouTube, follow me on social media, or watch me stream on Twitch. And if you really like what I do, please consider supporting over on Patreon, or perhaps by purchasing a shirt or mug from my merch store. Links to all of those things are in the description below. And, as always, I shall return soon, so until then, be excellent to each other and thanks for watching. Farewell.